Well, let's go back to this map so that you can follow along as I list some of the voyages of discovery. We're not going to go into great detail on this, but it does need to be covered, and some of these names do need to be mentioned. So, first voyage, of course, Christopher Columbus sailing for Spain, 1492. Then, sailing for Portugal, Vasco da Gama, who is the guy who went down the west coast of Africa all the way down and rounded the southern tip of Africa and found his way within just a few years after Columbus finally to India and made contact with India itself. Then you've got Pedro Alvarez Cabral, also from Portugal, who in 1500, kind of by accident, discovered Brazil. And didn't quite know at that time Brazil was part of a larger continent, as we covered before when we talked about Vespucci. We'll come back to, well, no, let's just talk right now about Vasco Nunez de Balboa, who in 1510 landed in Panama, right there at the narrowest part of Central America, where it's just about 40 miles wide. And he and his men started moving inland to explore, and lo and behold, within 40 miles, they had explored all there was, on that route anyway, and come to a whole other ocean, which Balboa named the South Sea. So when you talk about when you hear talk about sailors in the South Sea, they're talking about the South Pacific specifically. South Pacific specifically. Then you've got Hernan Cortés, who sailed from Cuba westward and landed in Mexico. You had Ferdinand Magellan sailing for Portugal. Cortés was for Spain, as was Balboa. Magellan, sailing for Portugal, was the very first, or his crew, very first people to circumnavigate the globe. That is to say, to sail completely around the world. And it was Magellan, by the way, who gave a different name to the South Sea, as Balboa had called it, because it was so much calmer than the Atlantic, he called it the Pacific. And that's where we get that name. So I said that his crew sailed around the world. He didn't quite make it. He almost made it all the way, but he was killed by natives in the Philippines, and his first mate, Elcano, took over and finished that voyage. So those are voyages by sea. Now let's talk a little bit about land explorers, who were for all these were working basically for Spain, and these people have come to be referred to as conquistadores or conquistadors, conquerors, which is what they were, leading expeditions inland, starting with Juan Ponce de Leon, who was the first person to lead an expedition into Florida, and as you may know, got sidetracked looking for the fabled Fountain of Youth, which he never found, but lots of old people are still going to Florida to try to find it. Cortez, mentioned him once before, landed in Mexico in 1518, and within 3 years had conquered the Aztec Empire. Similarly, Francisco Pizarro, about a decade later, conquered the Inca Empire down in Peru. Now, these other three individuals I'm going to talk about in a little more detail, in part because, especially this first guy, they're just kind of fun to talk about. So, Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca was the leader of this expedition. If you know some Spanish, you'll know that his last name, Cabeza de Vaca, means cowhead. So, Lord Cowhead and his expedition headed inland, actually started in Florida and traveled along the shore, along the Gulf Coast there, landed in Galveston, Texas, and started going inland looking for gold. And, it was not a real successful expedition. Not only because they didn't find any gold, though they did find in northern Mexico a copper baby rattle. That's about all that they found, so far as that goes. Also, now, Vaca had told his men not to bring too many supplies, but they did anyway, and they were kind of weighed down. And so they were overburdened, plus they got lost and basically wandered around what is now the Texas-Mexico border for years. They were lost for years and finally made their way down to Mexico City, which was by that point, established capital of New Spain. But they were lost for a long time. So Cabeza de Vaca, there he is. And this other guy, one member of the expedition, only I think 3 members were left when they finally made it home to Mexico City. But this guy, Esteban, also known as Estebanito, Estebanito means Stevie, so Esteban is Stephen. He was a slave, an African slave, who was part of the expedition. And turns out he was possibly the most important part of the expedition. Esteban was very talented linguistically. He could pick up languages very easily, and he picked up several of the native languages and was able to communicate with the tribes among whom they were wandering. He was also very talented just at talking in general, to the extent that he was able to convince several of the tribes that they were sacred, holy men, not the tribes, but this expedition, and even in some cases able to convince them they were divine beings, which basically Esteban saved their bacon more than once. African American history really, in a lot of ways, starts with Esteban, who was of African descent and in America. Maybe the first, if not certainly one of the first, and definitely the first prominent and influential historical figure to be of African descent in the Americas. Now, when they finally did make it home, they had picked up stories that Esteban had picked up stories about 7 mythical cities of gold to the north, called the 7 cities of Cibola. So another expedition started up, the Narvaez expedition, looking for those, and Esteban went out ahead, scouting ahead of them, and disappeared. So we don't really know. There's some reports he was killed by the Zuni, some reports that he actually was just tired of dealing with the Spaniards and went to live among the Indians. Then, a few years after that, another expedition, this one led by Francisco Coronado, and here they are, walking through the desert, looking for the 7 cities of gold, which did not exist, of course. There were other similar legends that the Spanish encountered. For example, here in the northwestern part of South America, there were tales of a place called El Dorado, the city of gold, which had so much gold that all the buildings were made of it, and the king was constantly covered in gold dust. And they wandered around, the Spanish in that area wandered around looking for that with no success, because there were no such places. On at least one occasion that I can think of, we know pretty well for a fact that the native translator who was captured by the Spanish, this was in Oklahoma where I'm talking about, made up a story of gold cities, because he was about to be killed by the Spanish, and he's like, "Hey, you like that shiny gold, or that yellow stuff? I can show you where there's lots of it." And basically, he was just kind of stringing them along so as not to be killed. They finally figured out he was stringing them along, and they killed him. But it's kind of a joke, a running joke among native peoples, that there may be some element of truth to this. That as the Spanish went deeper and deeper inland in North and South America, looking for these golden cities, every native group they encountered, having heard stories about these crazy white people, said, "Oh yeah, the shiny yellow stuff. You're looking for this city that's just a little bit further that way out of our territory." And so off they went, wandering in circles. Well, I also want to mention this expedition specifically, Hernando de Soto, who started off also in Florida and led this expedition in the from 1539 to 1543 that went all through the what is now the American South. And it's kind of like Magellan. He made most of the trip, but then he got killed, and someone else took command and finished the trip. But this is significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, this was the first European exploration of the American South. You can see he goes right down there through East Tennessee. He goes through Tolly, which is actually not far from what is now Fort Loudon State Park. You see there in western North Carolina in the mountains. He met the Chalaque, which is the Spanish spelling of Chalaki, which is pronounced by would later be pronounced by the English as Cherokee. That's one thing. Another thing is that as he and his men traveled through the American South, the cultures they encountered were very similar to the cultures in Central America. Very highly structured, often with kings, with not pyramids, but huge mound structures. That's very different from what I have described to you earlier when I was talking about native culture in North America. And that's because as De Soto passed through, a huge wave of disease came along with him in his wake and killed untold numbers of people. It wiped out whole tribes. And in some cases, it wiped out almost whole tribes. And the remnants of different tribes had to come together to form new groups in order to survive. And their culture, because they had this huge setback and all this death and were having to basically start over from scratch, their culture became much more simple than it had previously been. So that when Europeans came through here again in large numbers 150 years later, they found the Cherokees and Choctaws and Muskogee Creek and etc. living in the way that I described earlier in this course. This is called the Mississippi Shatter Zone by as I mentioned when we talked about Columbus, Queen Isabella was a little put out by his savagery, his barbarism in how he treated the native peoples that he encountered, because one of her reasons for agreeing to this whole thing had been to expand the Catholic Church and to save souls, so to convert the Indians. And Columbus went straight to enslaving them and cutting off their hands and raping them. So a document was drawn up beginning in 1513 that would make everything legal, because there was some question as to whether or not these native peoples had basic human rights, had natural rights, and that included the right to property. So this legal document was prepared that sort of outlined the fact that the native people had to agree to recognize the claim on their land by Spain as authorized by the Pope, as therefore authorized by God, and while we're at it, give them an opportunity to convert to Christianity. So, after 1513, whenever any Spanish explorers encountered new Native American tribes, they would read this document to them in Spanish, And of course, 99.9% of the time, those Indians they were talking to would know no Spanish whatsoever. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. But the important thing was that the legal requirement was enacted and they were given a fair chance. So here is part of that requirement, which is called el requerimiento, the Spanish requirement that it's required this be read. So here's what was read in Spanish to the Indians. Wherefore, as best we can, we ask and require you that you consider what we have said to you, and that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and that you acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world. But if you do not do this, and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that with the help of God we shall powerfully enter into your country, and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of their highnesses or ours, nor of these cavaliers who come with us. So really that was just a technicality, because no one on the other side could understand it, and even if they did, no one on the other side would ever agree to it. It reached the point that they no longer took out this document and read it directly to the native peoples they encountered. And what they started doing was just have a guy standing on the bow of the ship as it pulled into the harbor and read it aloud to the continent. And so then that requirement was taken care of, and they could therefore come in and act upon it. Sounds perfectly fair, doesn't it? This brings us to the story of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was born in Spain, in Seville, I think, and at the age of 18 accompanied his father in the year 1502 to the island of Hispaniola. This was 10 years after Columbus first set foot on it. They became colonists. His father had a plantation, and even though he was in his only in his late teens, de las Casas also acquired land and had his own plantation and owned slaves. Now, the slaves we're talking about are Taino slaves, the local indigenous people. As a slave owner, he participated in raids against the Taino, who had done the best they could to try to rise up and defend themselves. In 1510, when he was, I guess, 26 years old at that point, he was ordained a priest. The first person to be ordained a priest in the Americas. So that in itself makes him significant. So he was a priest, but he was also still a plantation owner and slave owner. Now, around that time, some Dominican friars arrived on the island and were outraged at the treatment of the Taino people that they viewed as being horribly unchristian, and they refused to accept confession from anyone who owned slaves. And that included the local priest, de las Casas. He was one of the people who complained to the Spanish government and to the Vatican about these wacky friars interfering in their business, and the friars were recalled. Well, de las Casas then became involved in the conquest of Cuba. He went along as chaplain to the soldiers, having, a few years earlier been involved in the further conquest of the Taino personally. He went along as chaplain, and he had a religious epiphany. He had a change of heart. He saw things that were the worst atrocities anyone could ever see, he described it. And he realized that those friars had been right. And he turned over a new leaf and freed his slaves. And he began speaking up for the rights of Native American Indians, of Los Indios. And he moved to Spain to do that so he could be closer to the royal court where he could make his pleas heard. And he worked really hard for, well, the next half century, for the next 50 years of his life. He was appointed by the church with the title Protector of the Indians. And he lobbied very hard to end the system that was in place that was subjugating the Indians. And the system that had been put in place was called the encomienda system, by the way. So there were initial complaints about just outright mass enslavement of Indians. So this new approach, the encomienda approach, was instituted pretty quickly after Columbus was recalled, in which essentially Spanish gentlemen would be granted land in the New World, like the de las Casas father and son duo. And when that happened, because they were there providing protection and security to the local Indians, as well as religious instruction, those Indians owed them something. And what they owed them was labor. So a certain number of Indians from that community had to perform labor, whatever they were told to do, by the Spanish gentleman in charge. And they didn't just round up people. The community had to choose who was going to go do it, but they had to go do it. They had very few rights. They were essentially still slaves. I mean, it was not a matter of they could regularly be sold away, although sometimes they were. But even that was too much slavery for de las Casas. And so, due to his tireless efforts, 1542, a new set of laws were passed in Spain that protected the rights of Indians and protected them from forced labor, and it protected them from forcible conversion, which was a great victory for de las Casas and obviously for the Indians. But the people in New Spain, the Spanish settlers in the New World, hated it. They rose up against it. They ignored it. And eventually it all kind of fell apart. And in fact, de las Casas was brought up on charges of treason, because if he says it's wrong to have slavery and the Spanish crown has slaves, he's accusing the Spanish crown of sin. So that's treason. So he had to defend himself. He had to defend himself in a debate against this guy, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, who was the head of the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. So this debate was held before a jury of theologians in which each presented their arguments, with Sepulveda arguing that Indians are incapable of governing themselves because they're primitive and childlike and sinful in their nature and had to be forced into labor, and that was perfectly fine, etc., etc. De las Casas argued that that's not Christian. And both sides claimed victory, but I guess you could say de las Casas won because, he wasn't convicted of anything. And he went back to the New World and continued his efforts to protect the rights of Native people. Now, one misstep that he took was, early on, he called for an increase in the African slave trade, to import African slaves to do the labor, so that would alleviate the burden on the Indians. But then after not very long of seeing how that worked out, he realized that was wrong too, and he spoke against that. But all in all, the story of Bartolomé de las Casas is a very important story because it demonstrates everyone wasn't like Christopher Columbus. It demonstrates that everyone wasn't like the conquistadors. De las Casas was not the only person saying these things. He reached a lot of people and convinced a lot of people to come around to his way of thinking, and it did improve the lot of native peoples, at least to an extent. So there was not this kind of monolithic approach where everyone was the same in how they viewed native people. I personally think for every statue of Christopher Columbus that gets torn down, which I think should be all of them, they should put one up to Bartolomé de las Casas and also put one up to the native people. Anyway, and furthermore, the actions of Bartolomé de las Casas and the fact that he had a lot of support in his actions in defense of Los Indios also goes a long way to disprove the Black Legend, or Spain's Black Legend as it's sometimes referred to, which is an accusation that has been leveled against history books, historiography written by the British and later by the Americans. Now bear in mind that the English were the archenemies of the Spanish during the time period we're talking about. So the Black Legend is simply put that in English/British history books and records of the time and afterward, and then later in the American school books and history books, the Spanish were always portrayed as excessively, extremely cruel, even compared to the other Europeans. It's always presented as that they were just a lot meaner than anybody, far worse than anybody else. And well, here's an example from an old textbook with a picture here of De Soto feeding Indian babies to his dogs. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that may have happened, but I would be very surprised if the Spanish were the only Europeans that did it. In fact, I think an argument could be made that the English were actually the worst when it came to treatment of native peoples. So that's a little bit of anti-Spanish bias that creeps in, and it's also a bit of anti-Catholic bias, because it's usually blamed on not just the ethnicity, but the religion of the Spanish, which was different than the ethnicity and primary religion of the English and early on the Americans, as in the United States. All right, well, one more thing I want to talk about when we're talking about Spanish colonization is the incidents that led to the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico in the year 1680. And this occurred at the Taos Pueblo. Pueblo being basically a community, a series of buildings connected together, made of adobe by Puebloan peoples. In this case, these Taos Puebloan peoples had been dominated by the Spanish for about a century or more under that encomienda system, and were forced to do labor for the Spanish gentlemen who were there running things with the help of the Spanish soldiers and also of the priests. Now, under the encomienda system, theoretically, it's supposed to be fair to require this labor of Indians because you're providing them protection from other Indians. And in this case, that would be the Apaches and the Navajos. Well, Spanish were doing a darn poor job of protecting the Puebloans from Apaches and Navajos, who were raiding them with increasing frequency, which was really getting under their skin, literally in some cases. And there had been a long drought that exacerbated things and made things worse. And then to cap it all off, the priests there insisted that the local religion, which was still being practiced, be stamped out completely. That included ending the use of Kachina dolls, which is a Puebloan thing, in worship, and the spiritual leader of the Puebloan people there in Taos, whose name is Pope, was arrested and put in prison because he refused to convert to Christianity. By the way, if this should come up, I don't know, on a test or something, it's Pope with an accent on the E. He's not the Pope, okay? I've had people say that. Anyway, this was kind of the last straw. Pope was let out of prison finally, and once he was, he started coordinating a rebellion, an uprising. And at the given hour, the Taos Puebloans rose up to strike against their Spanish colonizers in a very bloody and very successful revolt, which led to the deaths of 400 Spanish colonists, including all the priests. They were targeted first. And the Spanish soldiers were chased out of the region of what would become known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe, by the way, means Holy Faith. So they were chased out and kept out for 20 years. So, sad part of the story is 20 years later, the Spanish came back in huge numbers and reconquered the peoples here. But they got to live their own way for another 20 years. Now, they got to return to their way of life for 20 years. And that's kind of a rare, even temporary, kind of like, a happy moment when we're dealing with the colonization of native peoples. So, one of the big consequences of this is that when the Spanish ran away, they didn't take all their horses. They had a huge horse herd, which they weren't able to take the time to gather up when they were running for their lives. And so the Pueblos had possession now of these horses, but they didn't really care that much. They had no use for horses. So they traded them away to their neighbors to the north, who were known as the Shoshone people. So the Shoshone people got these huge Spanish horse herds, learned to ride them, learned to breed them, and learned to trade them. And they became the premier horse traders of the American West. And it was their herds that provided sort of the seed for the herds that would be acquired by many of the Plains tribes. They essentially introduced the horse to the Cheyenne, for example, and to other tribes, and then those tribes introduced them to others, and the horse spread from there. One band of Shoshone who really were excellent at the use of horses decided that they wanted some new blood in their herds. They wanted more horses, and the best way to find horses by this point was to take them away from Spanish people. But they'd already chased away the Spanish people, so this particular band of Shoshones migrated southward toward the Texas-Mexico border, as it is now. And then they started raiding into the Spanish settlements there and taking people's horses, and also fighting against the local Indians there. So this band of Shoshone were called by the Ute Indians Comanche, which means they're always fighting us. And the Comanche are known as the great horsemen of the plains, some of the greatest riders of horses, of any culture, really, in the world. And that's literally because they were the first Native Americans in North America to have them. And so that's really another interesting, it's kind of like the story of Chinese Admiral Zheng He, how certain events can change, can shift the direction that history turns in. All right, well, let's leave the Spanish for now, and let's take a look at some of the other European colonizing powers and their approaches.